My name is Carlo Leifert, and I'm professor in the Department of Plant Science at Southern Cross University in Australia, and I'm also a visiting professor at the Department of Nutrition at Oslo University in Norway. I'm gonna talk to you about the evidence we now have that we really have to change to the type of integrated soil, crop and livestock management practices that organic farming uses to provide a logical framework to ensure food security and human health in the future. Because they are linked, the good thing is that there is increasing evidence that if you switch to organic agricultural practices, you get both better food security and human health at the same time. So let's go through that. I want to start by just reminding you what the difference is between conventional farming practices on the crop production side are from the farming practices used in organic farming. Because really the difference is in food security and health outcomes are linked to the farming practices that are used. If you look at organic farming, it prescribes, there's European rules that prescribe longer rotations. Any synthetic pesticide use is prohibited. Farmers can use certain minerals if they provide crop protection. For example, sulfur fungicides, and under derogation, copper fungicides are still used, can still be used in organic farming. Organic farmers use a lot of biological control methods and certain plant and compost extracts for crop protection. Organic farming prohibits completely any water-soluble nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, and potassium chloride fertilizers are also not permitted. But potassium sulfate, lime and microelement fertilizers are permitted if the farmers can prove that they are needed by either soil or plant analysis. When you contrast that to current conventional farming practices, where we have shortened our rotations or introduced monocultures more and more over the last 40 to 60 years, we've become heavily reliant on the use of synthetic pesticides for crop protection. This just gives you the number of different products currently permitted in the UK for crop protection in conventional farming. And our fertilization relies heavily on mineral nitrogen, potassium and phosphorus fertilizers, whereas organic farming relies much more on recycling nutrients via manure, green manures and animal manures. There is some widely accepted benefits now of organic farming linked to these farming practices. For example, most people now agree that there is lower energy use and carbon footprints in organic farming, and I talk a little bit more about that later, give you some detailed information on that. There is also other lower negative environmental inputs like nitrate leaching, phosphorus runoff and soil erosion. Higher biodiversity and the animal welfare standards in organic farming on most farms are higher. And if you want detail, have a look at the reviews that are listed in a recent systematic review paper we've produced. What wasn't so widely accepted until fairly recently, it is accepted now by most nutritionists as well, is that organic food also has a better composition in terms of nutritional value. So in terms of more of the things which are good for health and less of the things that are bad for health. And this has been really summarized in 3 systematic reviews which were on crops, milk and meat. Systematic reviews were basically the data from all published articles were averaged and analyzed. So what these meta-analysis came up with, they showed that organic food is estimated to have, when you look at crops, 20% higher antioxidant activity. And antioxidants, and especially the plant phenols, those are the compounds that are now increasingly recognized to be associated or to be responsible for the better health people have if they eat a lot of fruit and vegetables. There's also, they also showed there is 50% lower cadmium in organic foods, and cadmium is, of course, a very highly toxic heavy metal that accumulates in our body, and you can't really have a safe concentration. You have to keep your cadmium levels in food as low as possible. And this applies mainly to cereals. And because pesticides are not permitted, the pesticide concentrations in organic foods are much lower, and I show some detailed information on that in a minute. The meta-analysis for meat and milk showed that you have higher omega-3 fatty acids in organic products. These are very important for brain development, especially in very young and very old people like myself. And organic meat contains slightly lower saturated fatty acids, which of course we are supposed to reduce in our diet. And similar results were found for milk. Milk quite often mirrors what you have in meat. The omega-3 fatty acids are higher. The conjugated linoleic acid, these are compounds that were linked to reducing obesity, for example. They are higher, but organic milk has also 70% lower iodine levels. That in countries which don't use iodized salt can be an issue, but it can simply be addressed by increasing iodine supplementation to concentrates used in organic feeds, like, for example, the UK had to do. In countries which use iodized salt, this can be a benefit, especially in countries with high milk consumption, where iodine intakes are quite often too high. So the meta-analysis clearly showed that the nutritional composition of organic foods is better with respect to what the nutritionists feel is good for us and is bad for us. Have these differences in food composition. And they are really quite well understood now. And again, I've given you 3 papers at the bottom of this page, which give you more detailed information. But in simple terms, the use of high levels of nitrogen fertilizer switches off the antioxidant production in plants, and that results in lower antioxidant levels. The mineral fertilizer use results in higher cadmium levels in cereals, because mineral phosphorus fertilizers always have cadmium and also nickel as residues, and both cadmium and nickel toxic metals are found in higher concentrations in conventional foods. And obviously, when you use pesticides, you have pesticide residues. When you don't use them, you don't have them. And in organic farming, they are prohibited. The interesting thing is that in animal production, going away from grazing-based systems, like are prescribed in organic farming, but going to indoor production and using a lot more concentrate in your feeds, that is a main driver of the low omega-3 fatty acids, because really the animals take the precursors of these in via fresh green plant materials, and if you don't graze them, the concentrations are lower. So we are understanding quite well now where these differences in food composition come from. So for about 10 years now, the nutritional world accepts that there are serious composition differences. But then the big question was, do these composition differences really result in differences in human health? And until recently, 2017, you had to say the jury is still out. But there is so much new evidence from big dietary cohort studies where people basically investigated what people were eating over a certain period and what people were getting ill from over a certain period, and then compared that in people that were eating a lot of organic food and people who were eating virtually no organic food. And this research was mainly done in countries like Norway, Denmark, and France. And I want to give you some results from the French studies, which were really large cohort studies. They were so large that you could eliminate through your statistical programs any confounding differences in the diets people were eating. You have to remember, organic consumers tend to also have healthier lifestyle. They do more exercise and they have healthier diets. So it's quite often difficult to find out what the differences in health were coming from organic food consumption or their healthier lifestyle and diets. And I'm showing you here the results of studies which were large enough so that you could compare people who had basically the same diet, the same lifestyle, and still the differences were very large. So organic food consumption resulted in men in a 60% reduction in the incidence of obesity. In women, it was slightly lower. Metabolic syndrome, which is to do with being too overweight and having heart problems and having diabetes. Metabolic syndrome is also significantly reduced in people with high organic food consumption. And as is cancer incidence. Cancer incidence was overall lower by 25%, but certain cancers, lymphomas in particular, cancers which were also linked to pesticide exposure in many studies, there you had a massive reduction in the cohorts that had a high organic food consumption. You can see here 85% for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is just one lymphoma, this is all lymphomas. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma has been linked and was the reason why glyphosate was recently classified as a very much likely carcinogen. Glyphosate is the most widely used organophosphorus herbicide in agriculture. So when these cohort studies reported their results, you had for the first time very strong evidence that the differences in nutritional composition between organic and conventional foods, that better nutritional composition you have in organic foods results in differences in health outcomes. And obesity, metabolic syndrome, so that's linked to heart disease and cancer, those are the big diseases that we are faced with nowadays that cost our health services a lot of money. And obviously, if you can do something about that by changing your diet, we know that you can do something about that by changing your diet and by switching to organic food consumption, that will reduce public health costs quite a bit. If these studies are confirmed, I think our politicians will take notice of organic food maybe being something that can reduce costs, and public health is a major cost to governments. One of the main drivers, as the results already showed, of those cohort studies already showed, is obviously pesticide exposure. I'm showing you here the results of a recent dietary intervention study which investigated by how much you can reduce your pesticide exposure by switching completely to organic food consumption. And you can see here, you can reduce your exposure, total exposure, that's exposure from the environment and from food, by switching to organic food consumption by over 95%. The only group where you had less than 95% or less were the insecticides and the organophosphorus pesticides. And that is because these two pesticides are also used in domestic pest control. So people, for example, use insecticides in Greece, where this study was carried out, to stop mosquitoes being in the rooms, and that results in quite considerable exposure as well. But still, switching to organic food consumption reduces insecticide exposure by 70% and OPs by 80%. Most pesticides we find now in food, and we found in this study, are endocrine disrupting pesticides. So they mess with your hormonal systems. And we know that if you have exposure to endocrine disrupting compounds, that affects, for example, your likelihood of getting diseases like cancer. When these results were recognized, really the only question that people still have about the value of organic food is, but what about yields? Because when you look at the meta-analysis which compared the yields in organic and conventional crops, overall, the yields in organic crops are 25% lower. So basically, if in this graphic you had a value of 1 as an average, so this shows you the average, and this is then the standard deviation over the average, so the sort of variation you found with different fruit crops in yield. If it was 1, then the yield in organic and conventional was the same. If it was lower than 1, then, for example, here with all crops, the yield was only 75%. The yield was only 75% of conventional in organic. So I want to look at this a little bit closer. This study is relatively old, 2014. Yields in organic farming has increased since then. And I'll show you some more recent data later. But 25% lower yields without using any pesticides, without using any mineral fertilizers, except for a little bit of phosphorus, a little bit of potassium and some microelements, but no nitrogen fertilizer at all. That is really quite impressive overall. When you look at fruit, so that is basically tree crops which don't need a lot of nitrogen, you already have similar yields. And there is crops, for example, organic production, where I crop here in the Messara Valley in Crete, you already are at higher crops in organic production. Higher yields don't necessarily mean that the crops are cheaper to produce. In fact, our production costs are higher, but our yields, for a range of reasons, are 110% of those that conventional farmers achieve. And in fruit crops, so in these tree crops, there is not much of a yield difference. In cereals, this yield difference is real, but again, if you go into semi-arid regions, and most of the cereal comparisons are from Northern Europe and North America, if you go into semi-arid regions, your yields in organic cereals can be higher. In our recent variety trials here in Crete, the organic production systems resulted in 10% higher yields in organic production systems compared to conventional production systems over all varieties we've tested. And obviously some varieties do better in organic and some better in conventional. But overall the yields are lower. But although the yields are currently lower, organic farming will be the only approach to achieve high crop yields and food security in the future, because the current yields in conventional farming rely on massive inputs of non-renewable resources, while organic farming uses much less of non-renewable resources. And for the rest of my talk, I want to give you some more detailed information about that fact. If you look at the increase in yield we got in cereals, so cereals are a really good indicator of overall food security. So I will talk mainly about cereals, and it is quite topical because the war in Ukraine has shown us what happens if cereals cannot be made available anymore to the global food population, So if you look at the period of the so-called Green Revolution between 1960 and 2000, the Green Revolution, everything we did in the Green Revolution resulted in an increase in a roughly doubling of global cereal production. And we needed that because the world population is increasing. But this was achieved by an overproportionate additional input of non-renewable and increasingly scarce resources. For example, nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer inputs quadrupled, and so did the use of irrigated land, so did the use of irrigation water. Use of pesticides from very low levels in the 1960s went massively high in 2000. So again, a massive increase in pesticide inputs. Pesticides and nitrogen fertilizer production are the main reasons or the largest contributor to the energy budgets of agriculture, the manufacturer of those inputs. So what we are going to hit is what Kenneth Boulding, a famous American economist, once described as anyone who believes in exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. It's a little bit of self-criticism in there. Because this increase in cereal yields resulted in a massive reduction in input use efficiency, in the efficiency of use of non-renewable resources such as nitrogen fertilizer. Non-renewable, I will explain why I feel this is non-renewable. So basically we need now a lot more nitrogen fertilizer to produce a ton of food than we did in the 1960s. In fact, it's about 4 times as much. So just to labor that point, so we had a 2-fold increase in global food production. We had a 5- to 7-fold increase in mineral NPK fertilizer use, and an even greater increase in pesticide use. That resulted in a 2- to 3-fold reduction in nutrient use efficiency of our crops. In simple terms, we need 2 to 3 times as much NPK to produce a kilogram of food than 40 years ago. So we are now dependent in global food production on these inputs, all of which are finite. And we have an additional problem, and that is, since 2000, the yields in conventional farming have not increased anymore for a variety of reasons. One reason is that the input costs have increased much more rapidly than agricultural commodity costs. So what the farmers have to pay for fertilizer has increased, and this is a period until 2008, has increased much more rapidly than what the farmers get for their crops. And as a result, they can't afford to use more fertilizer to get higher yields. And our current varieties are produced for conventional farming, and they only produce high yields if they get overproportionately high nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer inputs. And we having now a repetition of this situation because of the war in Ukraine, because both Ukraine and Russia are major fertilizer producers. Fertilizers are produced, as you will see in a minute, especially nitrogen fertilizer, with high amounts of energy inputs. So what will limit food production in the future? Well, it's all those things organic farmers are not allowed to use or have to use in much lower concentrations. Nitrogen fertilizer, which is linked to the cost and availability of cheap energy, fossil fuel. Phosphorus fertilizer, potassium fertilizer, water, and pesticides, because again, the manufacture of pesticides is a large contributor to the energy use in agriculture. If you look at mineral fertilizer use and yields of winter wheat in a bit more detail, and I use an example for Germany, one of the countries which has very, very high winter wheat yields, and which has good statistics dating back to the 1800s, so you can make these comparisons. You can see that our yields have increased very proportionate to the increase in fertilizers. And initially there was more potassium and phosphorus used, and then when cheap energy became available, we used a lot more nitrogen fertilizer. And we have to start putting large amounts of pesticides in when we started to use large amount of nitrogen fertilizer, because nitrogen fertilizer makes our crops more susceptible to certain diseases and pests. That's also fairly well documented. Okay, what does this mean? What does this large input of nitrogen fertilizer use in conventional farming mean? You have to remember that to produce 1 kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer requires 36,000 kilojoules in a process called the Haber-Bosch process. That is roughly 1 liter of fossil fuel. So in Europe we use mainly gas, which is very expensive now. In China they use mainly coal to make their nitrogen fertilizer, but it's roughly 1 liter or 1 kilogram of fossil fuel. And the production process of nitrogen fertilizer, and I use for this example the nitrogen fertilizer we used at our experimental farm in Newcastle when I worked at Newcastle University, which is ammonium nitrate. That also results in the release of 2.38 kilograms of CO2. So that's CO2 equivalents. So that's either CO2 directly, methane, or nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. So that's the production process of nitrogen fertilizer that produces that much of CO2 equivalents for just 1 kilogram. On our farm we grew 50 hectares of wheat, which got 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per annum. That means we used 10,000 liters of fuel before we even planted the crop through the nitrogen fertilizer we applied. And we released 23,800 kilograms of CO2 in the atmosphere. Globally, we use now 120 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer. That means we use 120,000 million liters of fuel to produce it. And at this moment in time, only the production of the nitrogen fertilizer results in 10% of total global greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. When you then add to that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions you get after the nitrogen fertilizer has been applied to the soil through evaporation of nitrous oxide, for example, from the soil, then 20 to 25% of total greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are related to just the use of nitrogen fertilizer. And as our energy costs go up, as our governments realize that greenhouse gas emissions result in global warming, which will reduce the acreage we have available for crop production, they will increasingly limit the use of nitrogen fertilizer, or for many farmers in the third world, it will become too expensive to use. But I believe there will be an even bigger problem coming towards us from the availability of phosphorus fertilizer. Phosphorus is a mined mineral. So I want to explain a little bit why. It's a mined mineral, and numerous scientific studies concluded that phosphorus reserves will be depleted within the 21st century, the century we are currently in. So the pessimistic view is we run out in 30 to 40 years of the phosphorus rock or exploitable phosphorus rock reserves we know we have. The more optimistic view is that we find a lot more, and I'm pretty sure we'll find a little bit more, and then we have 70 to 100 years left. But in that period of time, it will get expensive at a rapid rate, because some countries like China will run out in 40 years. They know that. And then they will come onto the open market for phosphorus, and that means the phosphorus price will go up very rapidly. Only the mineral fertilizer industry or the mining industry's own development center predicts that we have 300 to 400 years left at current consumption, but they admit that consumption is likely to increase at least twofold, which means we are down to 150 to 200 years, even by their predictions. This is just a graphical representation of how much of this finite reserve we have managed to use up in 40 years. And you have to remember, it takes millions of years for these rock phosphate reserves to develop. If you look at who has the world phosphate reserves, most of it is in just one country, Morocco. China has the second largest reserves, and they know that their reserves will be running out in 40 years, because they are also the largest user of phosphorus fertilizer. And I also already alluded to what will happen if they start buying Moroccan phosphorus. So we always set in our research group the main research challenge. We have to do something about what will limit food productivity in the future. And this will be the cost and availability of nitrogen fertilizer, which, the non-renewable resource is energy, fossil fuel, phosphorus, potassium, water, and pesticides. What will happen to our yields if we run out of just one of these inputs? And I want to show you a slide that I do use in all my first year lectures, which is a slide which describes what happens if you just run out of one essential plant nutrient. And this describes the law of the minimum, which was formulated 150 years ago by a famous German agronomist, Justus von Liebig. And he described it already to his students using this barrel presentation, where the water level represents the yield that you can obtain with a certain combination of inputs. The barrels represent the soil, and the individual planks in the barrel represent the individual nutrients in the soil. So, what he said, and what all research since then has proven to be right, is it doesn't matter how much of other nutrients you apply. So it doesn't matter how much magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur you apply to the soil or have applied to the soil in the past. If your phosphorus is too low, then your yield will be determined by the phosphorus level alone. So if we run out of phosphorus and we stick to conventional farming methods, which I'm sure we won't, because we will see the yields go down, then coming back to the German wheat yields, we will go down to the yields that we had without phosphorus fertilizers in the 1880s. And we are already with organic cereal yields beyond 5 tons per hectare in Germany now. And that brings me back to what my old professor of agrochemistry said. Well, when we run out of phosphorus, then we have to go back to organic farming. And I'm sure that will happen as we run out of these nutrients. Actually, it will be before we run out of these nutrients. Before we run out, they will get too expensive for a lot of people and a lot of countries that are in the developing world. So what are the solutions? Well, the main approaches we have available are: we have to get much more efficient at recycling nutrients in our food chains. So we have to use animal and green manures particularly legumes, to increase nitrogen inputs via legumes. We have to recycle all crop residues, food processing wastes, either into animal feed or directly as fertilizer. We have to get much better at recycling communal and domestic organic waste. We have to get really good at changing our sewage systems so that we can use anything that goes down the toilet as fertilizer. And we have to change our sewage systems. We can't use the current systems which blow all that nitrogen that is in that waste into the air again. We have spent a lot of energy to get it out of the air in the Haber-Bosch process. We have to keep it there, so we have to go over to using anaerobic digesters for sewage treatment, like the Chinese increasingly do as well, and that produces biogas as well. We have to reduce the losses of fertilizers from soil. We have to get very good at that. We have to completely change our breeding again. Our current crops used in conventional farming are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium junkies. They are absolutely reliant on these inputs. They have adapted to getting these as water-soluble inputs. They are not good at taking them out of the soil by themselves anymore. And we have to reduce meat, egg, and dairy production and consumption. We have to get used to eating less animal products. And there is, however, some hope. And the hope is that organic production hasn't seen that plateauing of yields. In fact, yields in organic farming, mainly due to the fact of efficiencies of scale and farmers getting better at it. More farmers who have converted from conventional practice getting good at organic farming practice. The yields in organic farming have still increased over the last 20 years in the 2000s. And in the Scottish borders, we had an organic winter wheat producer for the first time produce nearly 10 tons per hectare. He would have been the first organic farmer if he had just a little bit more to join the 10 tons per hectare club. And this is a farmer who uses all technological inventions that you can think of in organic farming. A former banker, by the way. And the most recent meta-analysis of comparative yields estimated that once you do organic farming to the organic farming ideals with as many diversification practices introduced onto organic farm, you can reduce the yield gap, the current yield gap. The yield gap before conventional farming runs out of nutrients to less than 10%. So how can we as consumers contribute to food security? I believe, and I hope I have given you quite a bit of evidence to support this statement. We have to eat more organic food and we have to eat less meat, both of which everybody accepts now in the nutritional world is good for health, but I believe it's also good for future food security. The sooner we can change our practices, the sooner our farming gets used to use organic farming practices again, the sooner we will have more sustainable food production. And the importance of going away from eating so much, I'm not saying we should all become vegetarians or vegans. No, in fact, livestock has an important function. But doing intensive livestock production, using grain as feed, so using grain which could be used for human consumption as animal feeds is highly inefficient, because you need 3 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of eggs. And if you grow cows, if you grow meat, cattle on grain, you need 11 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of beef. This is a Wagyu cow. This is a slide from Japan. That's the most intensive indoor production system of beef, which uses the highest input of only grain in the feed. So if you do that, if you do this intensive conventional production, you lose a lot of calories in the process, and that is highly inefficient and not good for food security. I would like to acknowledge the funding we have received from the European Community over the years, which sadly in the UK finished when they left the EU via Brexit, one of the most stupid decisions a government has ever made, and the Sheep Drove Trust, who funded everything that was even too politically sensitive for the EU to fund. Thank you very much for your attention.